Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Cristina Fuentes. I am the Director of the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family, and I could not be more thrilled to be here with you today. I want to welcome you to Arizona's 5th Annual ACES Summit, Becoming a Trauma-Informed State. First, I want to welcome the Governor and Mrs. Ducey and express my deepest gratitude for their continued support and leadership in this arena. Thank you, Governor, and thank you, Mrs. Ducey. I also want to thank the Ace Consortium, whose efforts have been critical in shaping the landscape of ACEs awareness and trauma-informed care throughout the state. Today we have over 450 people in this room, from national, local, regional stakeholders, from a multitude of different sectors that, as you'll see from the workshops, are here to work together and think through together ways that trauma-informed care can impact the populations that they serve. We have folks from the health field, education, public safety, child welfare, child care, our faith community. And so I just want to thank you all for being here and engaging in this critical work and these important discussions. As we move through today's program, I highly encourage you to consider how trauma-informed care can positively impact your life, the life of those around you, and the life of those you serve. Arizona's efforts to become a trauma-informed state will increase the quality of life for children and for families statewide. It is also critical in order to accomplish our governor's goal for Arizona to be the #1 state to live, work, play, recreate, retire, visit, do business in, and gain an education. So thank you so very much for being here today, for the work that you have already done, and for the work that we have ahead. And we wouldn't be here today without the tireless and committed work of so many in our state, in particular the work of the Ace Consortium. Founded in 2007, the Ace Consortium is a diverse group of individuals working together to reduce and prevent childhood adversity and build resilience in the individuals across our state. Marcia Stanton, who is the founder of the Arizona Ace Consortium and the Senior Program Specialist for the Strong Families Program at Phoenix Children's Hospital, is here with us today. And Marcia has played an integral role in increasing awareness of the impact of childhood trauma in this great state. Please join me in welcoming Marcia Stanton.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am thrilled to be here. It's so exciting to see everyone here. We have a really terrific program, so I know that you'll agree. Today really is a dream come true for me personally, and I think for the ACE Consortium. When we started more than a dozen years ago with kind of this ragtag group of individuals that were interested in this topic, and literally it started with 2 people in a conversation, and then we would pull in someone else, and they would pull in someone else. And it has grown into this dynamic, exciting, productive grassroots coalition. So to see everyone here interested and supportive of this work is just so heartwarming. So thank you all for being here. Before we kick off the program, Maria mentioned a few things, but I just also want to reiterate our sincere thanks to all of our sponsors. You saw them up on the screen, but we wouldn't be here without their support. Casey Family Programs, Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Governor's Parents Commission, and then additional sponsors, First Things First, Southwest Human Development, the State Departments of Health Services, Corrections, Juvenile Corrections, Economic Security, have all been huge supporters, so we're very grateful for that. In addition, as Maria said, we're so grateful and thankful to Governor and Mrs. Ducey for being here, helping lift up this issue and getting a level of attention that we think it really deserves, and that will really, our efforts will really serve to improve, Arizona for all of us. So what started as this small group, this kind of spark of conversations, I think not only in Arizona but around the country, has turned into a wildfire. And I hope it's kind of a controlled burn. But there's just so much. I used to scour the internet and talk to people all around the country to find out who was doing anything related to early adversity and ACEs and trauma. And it was a challenge to find many people. Now the challenge is trying to, make sense of all of the wonderful information that's out there. So that's a nice problem to have. But today, I think, really marks a crucial shift because the conversation has always been about increasing awareness. But what we have an opportunity today is to really talk about systems transformation. We can help individuals, and we can, and we should, and we will continue. But really, if we want to impact large numbers of people and really in our state, we have to talk about systems transformation. So we're so excited and grateful to be having this conversation. And we know that in Arizona, as across the country, it's not unique to our state, but kids and families are in crisis. We have huge issues that face many families. And hopefully you will have picked up our newest report, which is out on the tables, but this is some of the latest information about the incidence of trauma in kids' lives in Arizona. But I think the important thing today, and with this issue, is the issue is nothing if it's not about hope, right? That's why we're here today. And it's hope for the future, it's hope for what we can do and what we will do. And I think what better way to kind of start this morning off than talking about hope and kids is with a children's choir. So we're really excited that we have the Advanced Choral Ensemble from Coronado High School, directed by Mr. Sam Brazen. So we would ask that they come in. So please welcome Coronado High School.
And we are so happy to perform for you today the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose bright stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner
Thank you, Mr. President, and all the students. That was terrific. Thanks. Also, I realized, thank you. A few people that I forgot to thank that I neglected to, I didn't want to, is Nicole Stanton is here, and we'll be speaking in just a moment. She has been a huge champion of the work around the state for many years, improving the issues of child well-being and particularly bullying. So we're really excited that once again, I think she's, Nicole, where are you? I think you've been involved at all of our Ace Consortium and many other activities, so we really appreciate your participation. Also, Maria and her staff at the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family, they have done all the lifting on making sure things happen today, so we are very happy and thankful for that. All the event volunteers, and then I think lastly the Ace Consortium, because these are the individuals that have shown up for the last dozen years to meetings and taken their time out and volunteered their time and are still out there evangelizing about this issue. So many thanks. In fact, how about stand up if you're a member of the Ace Consortium? Any? Good. Thank you. Thanks. So I'm really excited that this morning we're going to have a traditional blessing, and I have to put my glasses on for this one. But Mr. Royce Manuel and his wife, Debbie Nez Manuel, they're members of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, and they're well known for the cultural educators and community leaders in the land of Akmural-Ak-Otham. That didn't roll off the tongue, sorry. And they work as a team to engage adults and youth alike to continue reviving and teaching tradition, not only for themselves, but for posterity, so that this day and the next ensures that we recognize the fortitude of indigenous heritage in Arizona. And while one specializes in preserving and strengthening cultural identity, the other specializes in critical thought, purpose, and mindfulness. And although their areas of expertise are slightly different, they are far better together than they are apart. And before we welcome them, I just want to say I just got to know them a little bit this morning, and such a delightful couple that are doing really amazing work and have been involved not only in helping promote the cultural traditions, but really have an understanding and are critically in the issue of childhood adversity and helping their community. Royce is a firefighter. And I'm going to ask them to say a few words, but if you'll please join me in welcoming. And one note: please don't record or pictures of the blessing. So thank you, Royce. Debbie.
Good morning, everyone. She Ace Consortium, Selna Building Bushes Chin, Sitna Jenny Dasha Che, Trabahan Tashanale, She Ace Lay Twa Dan Yes at that Nasha, Queen the Salt River Indian Community Shagan, Shalchine A Tra, Megan Do, Haley Do Shandin Dalia, Ado Shastri, A Royce Manuel Walia. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this great event. I already seen one of our Native relatives out there. Could you please stand if you are Indigenous from Arizona? Yay! It's always really nice to see our relatives out there serving as champions in our community. This work is by no means easy to be a part of in everyday, in our everyday lives. But I really want to share information about Royce. Is that he started working in his community at a very young age, and grew into this individual who serves his community with a deep sense of passion. No matter who you are in the community, no matter if you're a child who's just been born to an elder who is transitioning into another place, he's always been there. It's a beautiful thing to call on him to be there and to be present. But he is a retired firefighter in his community for over 22 years, and I served as a clinical counselor for domestic violence and doing outreach and intervention and individual counseling, clinical counseling, and it's been very good and good work. to see outcomes, fast forward maybe 10, 15 years, and you have someone come back that you've seen in some of the worst case scenarios, and you see them succeeding and reestablishing their family and, winning. And I think that's the most beautiful part of our work. We often don't see those immediately. It takes time to accomplish that. But today, we're here to share a piece of our heart with you. I think that's the most important thing we can do today as you prepare to take on the work that you're doing in the coming days, and then also to as you go back into your community. So thank you very much, and we appreciate being invited here. Thank you, Governor Ducey and Angela, and for Bruce Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry, for being here, bringing all of those teachings. And I enjoyed talking to Bruce this morning. He recognizes that the indigenous framework has been here for much longer, and people are recognizing the value of that. So thank you.
Good morning. My name is Royce Manuel from Salt River Indian Community. Just to give you a background, that Salt River, we're Akmardatam, we're river people. And this land that we're on right now is basically our land base. We go all the way from here, we're the farthest north of our community, all the way into Mexico. In Mexico, our farthest community is called the Tuagatam, which is the mountain people. They still speak our old dialect. So we have a really, really long, wide range of land base that we actually occupy. But one of the things I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and have you stand. And I'm going to take you on a journey. When we're talking about blessing, this is one thing that you got to think about the Salt River. We were called it Akmar. There was so much water through there, a 5-foot salmon was caught near A Mountain. That's how much water there used to be through there. So you got to imagine what it was like at a time. So I want you to go ahead and close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Take another. A third one. And a fourth one. As we rise, we walk to the river, and we stand at the river's edge, and we can hear the water, we can feel the moisture in the air. And you say to yourself, if I can get into this water today, I can do anything. This water will make me strong. You immerse yourself into the water, and you go in and put yourself completely underwater. You come out, put yourself in again, put yourself a third time, and the fourth time. The fourth time, you can feel the inviting of the water. Now it's not as cool as it was when you first got in. You come out, and you stand at the water's edge, and you wait for the sun to come up. As the sun is warming your body up, then you say, Josh, thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you for this wonderful time that we are here, that we are among you. Thank you for allowing us to be, you have all the riches that you have that's provided for us. Thank you, Josh, for allowing us to continue with our family and our friends. Thank you for the leadership that we have that represents us. Thank you for all those that have chosen different jobs that provide for us. Those in the military, those in the officers, those in the fire department, all those in the medical field. Keep those people in our hearts forever. Keep them understanding that we appreciate everything that they do. Keep in our hearts also very strongly our grandparents that brought us to where we're at today. Thank you for the children that we can guide them. Thank you for their understanding that we will be able to provide for them so that their life can be a little bit more enriched. Thank you for allowing us to having our obstacles, because with that it creates a strongness in our heart. Thank you again for allowing us to be among all that is living, all that is around us. Thank you for the opportunities that you have been providing for us. Thank you for this group that we have here today. Thank you for all their achievements they've been able to do and what they are going to do. Thank you for allowing us to be again in your presence, that we continue to grow and that we continue to develop all the information that we could become more and more more advanced in what we have to do. Thank you for allowing us to be here today. Thank you, Josh, for this wonderful day. As you open up your eyes, you can feel the warmth on your body, and you feel that coolness that's now that you're starting to feel. Remember, those steps that you walked in have been washed away, and the steps that you make coming out has been a renewal for you. So thank you, allowing for me to give you that in this little journey that I've taken you on, and let's continue our day.
And what we do is we ask you to not clap, because when you clap, you're chasing all that energy away. So we instead ask you to take your hands, your palms, and you bless yourself with all of those words of that goodness, and allow it to carry you through this day and in your conversations and all of the work that you do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful start to our morning, and a way to remember why we're here. It is now my distinct honor to introduce our First Lady. I've had the privilege of working alongside and getting to know Mrs. Ducey over the last year and a half, and I can tell you she is passionate and laser-focused, especially when I have come to learn are the guiding lights of her life, her family, and her faith. Mrs. Ducey is an amazing and dedicated wife, daughter, mother, sister, aunt, and she has extended that love and passion to the children of Arizona. We are very, very blessed to have a First Lady committed to preventing and reducing adverse childhood experiences and their impact. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our First Lady, Angela Ducey.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Maria. Well, I just want to say good morning and welcome to everyone to the 5th Annual ACES Summit, my first, Becoming a Trauma-Informed State. And I am truly grateful for all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to be here for this important work. I'd also like to thank Nicole Stanton with the Ace Consortium and Casey Family Programs for all the work you've done to put this together today, and also your continued support statewide in Arizona for all of your efforts to create a trauma-informed state. For Doug and I, the work to protect and improve the lives of children, specifically within the foster care system and children at risk of entering the system, is deeply personal. We both have experienced firsthand the devastating effects of adverse childhood experiences and trauma on our sweet little nephew of 5 years. In fact, when Doug and I first sat down to discuss the potential of him running for governor, I said, okay, I will fully support you if you will take head on and tackle the crisis within our foster care system that we were seeing here in Arizona. And I'm proud to say he took on that challenge head on. Since 2016, Arizona has seen a 25% reduction in the number of children in out-of-home care. And the leadership, yes. And the leadership at DCS, Casey Family Programs, was recognized, Director Greg McKay, for its Casey Excellence in Children Award for your exceptional leadership, Director McKay, and we are very blessed to have you lead this state. In May, Director McKay also received the Child's Help Voices of Children, their national award for his extensive work in protecting Arizona's children from abuse and neglect. The recognition is well-deserved, Greg, but there is more to do. Over the years, Doug and I have learned from watching our nephew grow and thrive and adjust that his ACE score and the trauma he survived played a significant role for him in his life and the lives of everyone who cares for him. I walked the journey with my sister through fostering and adopting our sweetie pie. And neither one of us, this was 6 years ago, maybe the journey started, and neither one of us had ever heard of the ACE study. Now, she's a lot smarter than I am. She has her BS in special education, her master's in educational leadership, and her PhD in curriculum and instruction. So this is someone who works daily with children who have survived traumas, and she had not heard of the ACE study 6 years ago. And when she went through her training to become a foster parent, she and her husband, there was very little, a little mention on trauma, but nothing about the study. So we have come a long way in just 6 years, thanks to the Ace Consortium, and great work to build upon. In my experience as an aunt since 2014, I've had also the great privilege of chairing the Governor's Council on Child Safety and Family Empowerment. As a council, we have a goal of preventing and reducing ACEs and building a more trauma-informed state, and that is really the core of our work. From the beginning, it was very apparent that the council could not achieve these objectives on our own. So I would really like to today express my appreciation for all the community groups, the nonprofits, the faith-based organizations that have partnered with us to support vulnerable children and strengthen Arizona families. Just one of the many significant results produced by this collaboration is the Arizona Care Portal, which was launched in December 2015. Through the Care Portal, in partnership with the Department of Child Safety, families in crisis are connected to churches, and they are able to provide need-based resources to safely keep kids at home, thus preventing trauma. This has prevented thousands from entering the foster care system. This month marks Care Portal's 3rd anniversary, and to date, the economic impact in our state is over $1.5 million, all donations, and it has served over 4,300 children to date. So we are immensely proud at the Council of this work, and we want to thank everyone involved for working to make this a success and changing lives. Care Portal and the work of so many others to keep our children safe at home is critical to the success and well-being of our children. We know that children in foster care, we know that children in foster care and those at risk of entering foster care are especially vulnerable to adverse childhood experiences. In fact, half of all children that enter the foster care system have an ACE score of 4 or more. My nephew has an ACE score of 9. Sadly, the number of people who have suffered 2 or more adverse childhood experiences is greater in Arizona than in any other state. We know that the research says, and it's fascinating, and I'm so grateful that we have Dr. Perry here this morning to talk about the brain science behind this, but the number of ACEs is on the rise, and as that number rises, so do the risk for lifelong mental, behavioral, and physical health problems. The correlation is really astounding. The good news is there is a great deal of research, especially around ACEs, the impact that it has on a child's brain and development, and that can inform us and help us improve the ways that we serve and interact with those children. So we are exceptionally grateful to have Dr. Perry here. He's a national figure, if not a global figure and expert in this field, and he will share more with us in depth about the impact of the brain's development and what can be done to help our children heal. Because ACEs, if they're not specifically addressed, can alter the way a child's brain grows. It literally changes their brain. And the connections in the areas that develop or don't develop or overdevelop, like areas that are responsible for flight or fight. And this can have lifelong impacts and drive the way that people respond and engage throughout their lives. And I think if you looked at our populations within the corrections facilities, you would find a very high ACE score amongst that population as well. But we know there is much we can do to prevent ACEs, to mitigate their impact, and we know that the presence of a loving, caring, and supportive adult can heal the impact of ACEs and trauma, and I've seen it in my very own family. So what can we do about this? Advancing the progress in the area of trauma-informed care can play a big role to help prevent and mitigate the impact of ACEs. Expanding and strengthening trauma-informed care can also prevent kids from entering foster care, can enhance the placement for the stability of those in foster care, because as we know, every time they disrupt from one placement, it's another trauma. By the time my sweet nephew got to my sister's family, that was his 5th placement. He was 7 years old. And we also want to support the permanency within the homes. When we serve children and families within the foster care system through a trauma-informed lens, we can reduce placement disruptions and focus more on healing the existing trauma. As you will learn this morning, these experiences, particularly in our youngest children, can have a devastating impact if not properly addressed. So this is where the powerful partnerships in this room come to play. Together, we can raise the standard of care and support services that we provide to Arizona's youth and families. We can help mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experience. So I want to thank to many of you, especially the Ace Consortium, that are doing so much already to have lasting positive impacts on countless lives here in Arizona. And we have a lot of momentum to build on as a state. I encourage all of you to join me in using the knowledge that we gain here today to help drive a broader conversation, more collaboration surrounding trauma-centered care. We must do all we can to provide the care, the support, the security for children like my nephew and the other 15,000 or so kiddos out there today that need and deserve nothing more than a stable, loving home. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve alongside everyone here today, and together, all of us, we will continue to make Arizona a healthier, safer, stronger state. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you my husband of 28 years. He is a wonderful father to our 3 sons, who are all home at once now from break, and it's kind of crazy at our house. You get used to 1, and then 2 come home, and it's a little louder. He's the 23rd governor of the great state of Arizona, and I think a wonderful leader for our state, Doug Ducey.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Sit down, sit down. Hey, I may be biased, but isn't Arizona fortunate to have Angela Ducey as its first lady? I used to like to say on the campaign trail, this is exhibit A of my good decision-making ability. And I also want to say how thankful I am for all the people who have come up to me and extended gratitude that I'm here this morning. And I want you to know how happy I am to be here and that I didn't have a choice. This was something I was definitely going to be a part of, and I'm thrilled to be a part of what's happening inside this room. I want to say thank you to the Ace Consortium and to everyone who is making this summit possible. And look at the size of this summit and look at the growth that it's experiencing. Nothing is more important than the well-being and safety of Arizona's kids. And I'm grateful for all the time and energy that the leaders have put into this event. As Angela just mentioned, when I first came into office, the need to address serious issues inside Arizona's foster system was personal and it was urgent. Our foster system at that moment was likely the most broken foster system in the country. We were determined to bring significant and lasting change to our system for the sake of the kids who had suffered just as our nephew and godson had suffered. And thanks to so many of the people at this summit and throughout the state, Arizona's made great strides to turn a broken foster care system into one of the best in the entire nation. As Angela mentioned, we've seen the number of kids in out-of-home care safely reduced by 25%. And our backlog of 16,000 uninvestigated cases in our system has been eliminated. Now, I want to emphasize that the credit for Arizona's progress on all of these fronts goes to all of the dedicated people across the state who serve our children and families including our foster, adoptive, and kinship families. And I want to give a special thank you to Greg McKay. When I came into office, I made some changes in leadership in state government. Greg McKay was one of those changes in leading the foster care, the Department of Child Safety. And about a year into his tenure, I don't know if you remember, the Arizona Republic wrote an above-the-fold editorial calling for Greg McKay's termination. Greg came to see me. He said, "Governor, I know you read the paper, and public opinion can sometimes influence people in elective offices." And I said, "Greg, I want you to know you have nothing to worry about. You have my 100% support, and no one else wants this job." It was the hardest job in the state, including my job at that time, and now we can celebrate these successes. We know there's so much more left to do, but this isn't something we're hiding to the side and hoping that doesn't create bad news on the front page. It's something where we're seeing improvement. We have a plan. We're improving along the way with better ideas and new science. And I want to thank not only the people that work inside our state government, but the volunteers outside of our state government. This is something that really does take the community to make a difference. And our faith-based community, which has been instrumental with this success and efforts like the Care Portal, simply couldn't happen without this partnership. So we're proud of the progress that we've made, but we know that there's so much more that we can and must do to prevent and mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. The number of kids in Arizona who have been subject to 5 or more ACEs could fill the Arizona Cardinals football stadium. That type of visual is simply devastating. And it's a major reason why our state is implementing trauma-informed approaches on many fronts. Our efforts include DCS's Victim Services Unit, which was created to safeguard victims' rights for children in DCS care. With this unit, liaisons are assigned to cases that ensure a child's rights are protected and that the appropriate agencies and authorities remain in communication. The Arizona Department of Health Services has also taken action by training more than 600 staff to help provide the knowledge and tools mothers and pregnant women need to protect their children from adverse childhood experiences. The list of trauma-informed efforts within state government continues to grow, but government cannot do this alone. It's my hope that you will leave here today motivated, inspired, and determined to apply more trauma-informed approaches in your day-to-day efforts. I'm well aware that we'll never be able to eliminate ACEs in the life of every child. But one thing we know is that trauma-informed care is a critical part of the solution. To Director Maria Cristina Fuentes, who we are so fortunate to have at the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family, to all the directors and employees at our state agencies, and to everyone in the private sector who works so hard to make a difference, I want you to know the gratitude and appreciation and the thank you I want to say for all that you do. I know that all of us in this room commit to making ours a trauma-informed state. We can make a lasting difference for so many, and we'll create a healthier and happier future for all. Thank you. God bless. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Governor, so very much for all those words and reminding us of your commitment and the commitment of the state to becoming a trauma-informed state. I am so happy I moved here. I am so happy I took this job. and to work for this governor and alongside this great First Lady. I've been asked to remind everyone to tweet and Facebook and everything and hashtag AZ Trauma Informed. So please feel free to get on social media, and it's hashtag AZ Trauma Informed. No, sorry, it's Trauma Informed AZ. Sorry. I'm getting this from the side of the room, right? What they said. So great. Well, that's a good chunk of our morning there. You shouldn't have me do these reminders. Nobody wrote it down on my thing, but it should be on your program, and you should pay more attention to that than to me. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Nicole Stanton. Marcia spoke briefly about Nicole and her work and her commitment. She has been an advocate for children's issues for a very long time. She has been a huge supporter of the work around childhood adversity, the work of the Ace Consortium. If you've been to one of these summits before, you have seen her before, and you know her commitment. She is especially passionate around issues surrounding bullying, which we know affect so many of our children and has such dramatic effects on a number of them. So we're very grateful to have you here, and everyone please help me welcome Nicole Stanton to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. On March 4th, 2014, I had the privilege of moderating the keynote discussion at the very first ACES Summit. I remember the organizers and I were high-fiving each other because we were thrilled that we had about 100 people register for the event, which lasted about an hour. Look at us now. I'm overwhelmed with the attendance today. What started as a local word-of-mouth campaign, as Marcia mentioned, to share a little-known body of research has grown into a statewide movement with wonderful champions like Governor Ducey and First Lady Angela Ducey. Mrs. Ducey, I know the governor stepped out, but please extend to him my gratitude for all that the two of you are doing to change the lives of children in Arizona and make their lives better. Let's give them another round of applause. Before the first ACES Summit, we actually had to educate the panelists on what adverse childhood experiences were, but just to get them to speak on the panels. Now, at the 5th annual ACES Summit, we get to hear from the person who has perhaps taught more Americans about the importance of childhood trauma than anyone else in our country. Dr. Bruce Perry is a senior fellow of the Child Trauma Academy and an adjunct professor at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. He is the author of over 500 publications, many of them about his neurosequential model, a neurobiology-informed approach to working with traumatized children. Dr. Perry has received numerous awards for his work, and probably best well known for converting Oprah Winfrey to the cause. So, Dr. Bruce Perry, we are very grateful to have you here today. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. I have no prepared remarks. I see all these folks and they've got like these incredible booklets and everything's like, in like 43 fonts so they can read it. I'm just going to warn you, I'm actually a really, really disorganized presenter. Very, very dependent upon slides, which I am going to put up currently, and I hope, wow, that was a big head. So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very honored. I am part of a network of professionals who are really all over the world trying to better understand the impact of experiences on development. And for the longest time, we focused on the impact of bad experiences and studied how that impacted the development of the brain and then the brain's functions, including thinking and feeling and behaving. And so our work had relevance for just about every system you can think of. public education, mental health, child welfare, and we were very interested in trying to help people in public systems better understand these issues, because we felt that if you understood what had happened, that you all would be able to figure out how to make those systems change in the way they put together programs and practices to hopefully address some of those problems. And we continued to do that, but along the way we realized that you all needed a little help. So we decided to also start focusing on what's the impact of positive experiences? What's the counterbalance to these bad things? And are there things that we can do that will influence the systems in the brain that have been impacted by trauma, neglect, and adversity that will actually lead to repair, recovery, and so forth? And so we now have a very significant body of our work, and many, many, many programs across the world are actively and intentionally looking at what we would call therapeutic approaches. And some of that's very positive. So what I want to share with you a little bit today is why what you're doing is so important. And then I want to give you a little bit of an exposure to some of the concepts that we think are really important as we collectively go through the process of inventing new ways of doing our work. Because make no mistake about it, we are inventing new things. One of the great things about the human brain, and I'll talk about this a tiny little bit, is that it's remarkably malleable. It's capable of changing. And one of the properties of the human brain, which is unique to our species, is that the human brain can actually absorb more bits of information per second than any other species. And what that means is we can make memory faster and more efficiently. And that means that we're able to learn things and we're able to pass things on to the next generation. And so the truth is we live currently very, very differently than we did 5,000 years ago. And the process of socio-cultural evolution, the process of inventing new things that we incorporate into everyday life, involves changing the brain. And part of what I want to do is make you sit back and realize that you are part of an active, intentional process of inventing new things. And I want to give you some principles and concepts that I think will help you in that process. But let me just start with this way. I think people learn best in context of stories and narratives, and also I'll probably end up talking about a lot of different stories, and I'll have my presentation will seem fragmented and all over the place. But there's a method to my madness, and what I want to start with is a little bit of a sobering look at how well our current systems collectively are doing with very complex trauma. Because of our work, as I mentioned before, that our work has relevance for a lot of our public systems. And one of the things that many of you realize, I think, is that in the states that have the death penalty, there are essentially mitigating factors that can be taken into consideration when the jury or the judge is trying to decide whether or not a person gets life or gets the death penalty. And so I don't get involved in the legal system that much. How many lawyers are in this room? Y'all make it very uncomfortable for people who are not lawyers in your system. So I try to avoid it as much as possible. But there are times when I think it's really important that we, people who have expertise, share that with people in courts, because their decision making will be better if they have better information. And so when I feel like I can learn something from participating in these cases, I will occasionally do this work. And this is from a real live case about 5 years ago. Someone in a western state, not Arizona, went in with a couple of his friends into a bar at closing time. There were 5 people in there. He kind of panicked, thought maybe somebody had recognized him, so he killed everybody in a very brutal way. And so he was found guilty, and this is from the sentencing phase. And in the sentencing phase, one of the things that you can consider as a potential mitigating factor is a history of mental illness or a history of child abuse and so forth. So this is a family tree of this individual right here. Here's the individual that did the murders. This is a family tree looking at the maternal side. These are called genograms for those of you, most people I think are familiar with these in a little bit. This is the paternal genogram. This is what happens if we put into the maternal genogram the individuals who were impacted by documented alcohol or drug abuse. This is what happens when you put in the paternal side. This is what happens when you put in and add this history of mental health problems. And now, again, those of you who've done this kind of work know that when you both interview people and you review records, when you get positive endorsements of these things, that's usually even an underestimate of how bad it was. So what you're seeing is an underestimate of what this child's and person's life was like. So this is the mental health problems. This is the paternal side mental health problems. This is when you add in the people in the maternal side who were involved in jail or the juvenile justice system. This is the paternal side. This is when you add in the documented cases of child abuse and domestic violence. This is the maternal side. This is the paternal side. This is when you add in the documented cases of sexual assault or sexual abuse on the maternal side and the paternal side. And when you start to think about this, look at this. Here's what I want you to hear. This person, before he killed 5 other people, and oh, by the way, we're now paying $50,000 a year to keep him in jail, and we will for the next 50 plus years, because he's a young man. So we're going to spend at least $2.5 million from this point forward keeping him. He did not get the death penalty, but he got life in prison, and we'll spend $2.5 million keeping him in prison. We spent over $1 million, we estimated, getting him to the point from birth to the point that he murdered people. So we've spent $3.5 million public dollars on this person. Now, he had 64 contacts with public systems that had the intention of helping him or diverting him out of a bad trajectory from the time he was conceived to the time he murdered those people. 64 times. Early intervention programs, high-risk pregnancy programs, early Head Start, special ed programs, mental health programs, probation programs, 64 times. Well-intended, publicly funded professionals looked at his circumstances through the lens of traditional mental health perspective, traditional child welfare perspective, traditional special education perspective, traditional education perspective, none of them trauma-informed. None of them developmentally informed. Good people, smart people, hardworking, well-funded, and he ended up killing these people. This is why what you're doing today is so important. It's not like we don't have enough money. This isn't a matter of money. And it's not a matter of goodwill. And it's not a matter of smart people. It's a matter of tools. You have been trying to build a house with one tool. You need more tools in your toolkit. People who do this work need to understand attachment. They need to understand the impact of stress on development. They need to understand healthy and appropriate models of discipline that don't involve shaming and punishment and exclusion and expelling. The very systems that were intended to help him actually made him worse. They misunderstood his behaviors, and they marginalized him, and they kicked him out, and they punished him. They were well-intended, but they made things worse. And I can guarantee you right now, I hate to say it, in this great city, right now, I'll bet there's at least 10 or 15 episodes that will take place over the course of this morning where a kid is misunderstood in school and is punished and marginalized and demoralized, and he will not want to come back to school tomorrow. And the probability is that that's a child of color and a child who's poor. And the probability is that because we didn't provide a trauma-informed, developmentally appropriate set of expectations and services for that child, he will end up consuming our time, energy, effort, and tax dollars in our other systems. Our police officers will get to know him. Our probation officers will get to know him. This is why what you're doing is so important. Now, this is not something that particularly new to any of you. Most of you have run into kids like this or families like this in the course of your work. The good news is that these things can improve. You can do work that will help children and youth who have been impacted by adversity. And you can educate all of these systems, ranging from the smartest person in an academic setting down to the least educated person who spends time with a child as could be a primary caregiver, could be somebody who takes care of the child in an early childhood setting. Every one of those individuals can better understand these kids, and when they do, the outcomes are astoundingly positive. So, let's talk about some of the good news, bad news stuff. One of the things about the brain is that it grows very, very, very rapidly early in life. And one of the things about the brain that I think most of you already know is that it's got all of these really complex networks that allow us to do a whole range of amazing things. So when you actually have a good thought, that's because something's going on in your brain. When you move your fingers, that's because your brain allows you to move your fingers in a certain way. When you see things, when you hear things, your brain mediates so many interesting and complex functions. It's a remarkable organ. But it's a complex organ. And one of the things that we've been trying to do in our work is take the known complexities about how the brain works and functions and see whether or not there are ways we can translate that into concepts and principles and language that people who are not trained as neuroscientists can actually appreciate and understand and incorporate into their work. And so that's part of what I want to do today. I want to talk a little bit about this, about the brain and some of these concepts that I think can be helpful in your work. But I want to do it, I don't want to just default to an overly simple model of the brain. I want you to appreciate how complex it is first, and then I'll talk about the simple part of it, because it's really, I think one of the challenges that we have in our work is that because we've invented this big modern world, we fall prey to the tendency to want to have a one-size-fits-all model. And so we create too many overly simplistic solutions to incredibly complex, diverse problems. And so I really do want you to be challenged to some degree to appreciate this unique quality that every person in front of you has. And then I'll talk about some of the simplification. So let's talk first of all with the brain. The brain's got all of these systems, and one of the things that we do when we teach, whether it's foster parents or educators or clinicians or whoever we're teaching to, we always emphasize the fact that the brain has this interesting hierarchical structure. So you've got this lower part of the brain. Everybody's probably heard of the brainstem. And that part of the brain is involved in a lot of really simple regulatory functions: body temperature regulation, respiration, heart rate, and so forth. And as you go higher in the brain, you get increasingly complex networks. And then you get to the top part of the brain, the cortex, which is the most uniquely human part of the brain, and actually the most uniquely part of your body. So it's no surprise then that the most uniquely human functions are mediated by that part of the brain. So speech and language, future planning, when we talk about executive functioning, it's in large part a cortical set of activities and capabilities. So this interesting thing about our brain is that we've got these systems that are basically organized in a hierarchical way. We go from simple regulatory systems low to these very complex systems at the top part of your brain. And it'll make, you'll be clear about why I'm emphasizing this in a minute. But the other thing I think is really important to understand about the brain is that it is comprised of a lot of moving parts. So your brain has really got a lot of stuff going on. So right now, as you're sitting here, and this is sort of a sobering thing to think about. As you sit here, and if I could look at every single aspect of what's going on in your brain, all of the, the chemicals that are in your brain, the genes that are being turned on and turned off, and you think about all the capabilities you have in this moment, you can think about, your high school days, you can think about your mother, you can think about what does your child look like, you can think about your favorite song, and all the stuff that you have in your brain. The neurobiological networks and the neurobiological conformations that allow you to sort of be who you are right now will be different right now, which is a really mind-blowing concept. That the very same neurobiological networks that allowed you to have all of the functions you had when you walked into this room this morning are going to be slightly different when you walk out of this room today. So your brain is always changing. It is never, ever the same. Now, this is a really positive thing, and this is why the brain is malleable. Those of you who remember your physics, systems that don't have a lot of movement are hard to change. Systems that are in dynamic activity are easier to change. And so the great thing about your brain is the more it is moving and changing, the easier it is to move. The easier it is to change. The more it's moving, the more it's dynamic. So 86 billion neurons, pretty complex, right? So you've got 86 billion neurons, and each one of these neurons has thousands of synaptic connections, places where it comes up against another cell, another neuron, and you release neurotransmitter across this space we call the synapse, and that transmitter, a chemical like norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, or a protein like an opioid, enkephalins, endorphins, they actually change the activity of the membrane, and that changes the activity of some biochemical things in the inside of that cell that goes to change things in the genome. And those of you who have heard about epigenetics, that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about that. But all of this stuff is dynamic. And you've got 1 billion synapses in every tiny little cubic centimeter of brain tissue. And you can go even further. You can look at the inside of one synapse, one synaptic bouton, one presynaptic terminal, and look at all these proteins, and all of this gets even more complex. and it gets more complex, because I've just been talking about the component parts of your brain. I haven't been talking about the dynamic activity. So if you start to put together the number of moving parts and the rates at which the simplest of these actually move, the depolarization of a neuron, you get something like 2.5 quadrillion depolarizations in your brain per minute. This is astoundingly complex. And so just think for a minute. Think about how complex that is, and then the overly simplistic explanations that we tend to use for how we understand people's behavior. We're usually not right. Usually not right. We're not, maybe. When you see these commercials that Billy's depressed because he's not releasing enough serotonin, and you're like, I don't think so. It's a lot more complex than that. So, now as complex as it is, one of the things that we do, we humans do all the time, is that we try to make complex things simple. And when we do that, we basically create these shortcuts. We make little models, we make little drawings, we take things that are really, really complicated and try to make them simple. And so, I'm going to basically tell you something that's a very simple version of how to understand the brain. And I want you to appreciate that everything that I tell you from this point forward isn't true. And I'm not kidding. It's not true. It's inaccurate in some way. But I also want to tell you that every single thing that you ever hear from anybody else about human behavior, about what the reason is, anytime anybody tries to give you a linear explanation about anything that has to do with human beings, it's not true. It may be useful. It may be a useful construct. There may be some truth in that comment, but it is not bedrock true. It's going to be incomplete. It's going to be inadequate in some way. And every single perspective that we have, whether you're a cognitive behavioral person or you're interested in transgenerational trauma or you want to focus on cultural anthropology or economics or whatever, we are all blind men at the elephant. We all see a tiny little piece of this incredibly complex thing that is human life, human existence. And I've only sort of talked a little bit about the complexity of telescoping down into one individual's brain. One of the things that's equally complex is starting to think about what happens when one human being with all that complexity in their brain starts to interact with another person with all the complexity in their brain. And so if you think about it, we're all part of these little different groups. And one of the great things about the human brain is that we're social animals. Human beings are relational creatures. We are neurobiologically organized to be part of a group. We use the word, I want Billy to grow up to be, quote, independent all the time. We talk about independence, but the truth is human beings neurobiologically and physiologically are incapable of independence. We are interdependent. We need each other. We literally, our physiology can only be regulated in a healthy way in proximity to other human beings. We are social creatures, which will turn out to be one of the most important aspects of both buffering present stressor and healing from past trauma, relational connection. And it's because of this quality of human connectedness that we are able to both survive and then ultimately to thrive. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Again, complexity. Think about the complexity of all of these different conformations and configurations of alliances and how people get together and can sort of play each other off each other. Any of you who have had multiple kids know what I'm talking about. They'll form little alliances here, and my kids, like the first, the third, and the fifth are one little group, and then the second and the fourth are a different group, and then when they all gang up against us, we know that that's because, they're trying to get something over on us. It's actually, it's a good thing when they're working together. We know it's going to be, they're doing something naughty, but, it's kind of fun to see them work as a team. So, little relational complexity. I'm talking just about sort of the time right now. And what I haven't really introduced is the complexity of transgenerational complexity. Because not only are we connected to the people in our present, we're connected to people in our past in very complex ways, not just in sort of genetic, epigenetic ways, but we're connected in social cultural ways. And so there are so many confounds if you think about sort of a human in the moment right here, and this is time in one line, and we've got all these connections that are influencing how we function now, and we have all these connections from the past that influence where we are. Our trajectory forward is going to be impacted by all kinds of things. Adversity, connectivity, opportunity, lack of opportunity, marginalization, inclusion, all of these things influence our individual functioning in ways that are both good and bad. And one of the things that's happened, one of the reasons I like to introduce a little bit about this complexity, is that I want people to appreciate that one of the major choices that we've made in our public systems to solve the problem of a lot of people living in the same space is to have a tendency to use one-size-fits-all approaches. And I'm not saying this to damn one-size-fits-all approaches. I just want you to understand what happens with one-size-fits-all approaches. So, I'm going to come back and show you, I'm going to do a little science first, and I'm going to come back and talk about one-size-fits-all approaches. So, let's fast forward to this. So, I mentioned this. The brain has this remarkable property to store experience. And one of the fundamental characteristics of how the brain basically stores experiences is that these neural networks that I've been talking about, these neurons and synaptic connections, these things change with repetition. And one of the characteristics of learning and one of the characteristics of memory is that any pattern of neural activity, any sort of networks of neurons that are activated simultaneously end up creating a connection. And this is just one of the fundamentals of how the brain works. Your brain is continually trying to make sense out of the world. And most of you, again, we all learn this like in elementary school, but most of us don't think about this that much. But if you think about your brain right now, the information that's coming into your brain, some of it's coming in visual, right? You see things and you hear things. And there's more, but let's just work on those for right now. So one part of your brain is getting input that's visual, another part of your brain is getting input that's auditory, and it comes into your brain separately. But the picture that your brain creates about this present moment is weaving these things together. It's connecting the sound with the image. And from the time you are in utero, your brain is taking all of this incoming sensory input from the outside world and all the input from your inside of your body, and it's taking these patterns of neural activity and it's trying to make sense out of the world. And so it will connect images and sounds that happen again and again and again and again. That's how you learn language. And this process involves literally moving of neurons. And so this is an old clip, but I just want you to see neurons move. This is dynamic activity of neural networks. The creation, activity-dependent creation of synapses. Pretty cool, right? I had brown hair back then. This was, I first came to Arizona back in 1996. I was talking about this stuff, and I had brown hair. That's crazy. Look at that. All right. So here, let's talk about this for a second. Let's pretend that this neuron right here, I'll stop this. Let's pretend this neuron right here was part of the auditory processing part of the brain. And the neuron over here, this neuron on the bottom is from the visual. And if you hear something and see something and hear something and see something, if it's let's say it's a four-legged furry creature, you see it, you see it, you see it, and every time you see it, you hear a bark, a bark, a bark, a bark. And pretty soon your brain connects the dog with the bark. And later on, when you hear a bark, you can activate the visual part of your brain. You create a visual representation of that, and you go, that's a doggy. And your brain does this with everything. Your brain is continually trying to make sense out of the world based upon what your experiences are. Now, because the brain is most actively developing in utero and in the first years of life, particularly the first year, this process of making sense out of the world is front-loaded to early childhood. Your worldview, the way you understand the world, is by and large a product of your developmental experiences in the first years of your life. That creates the lens through which you see the world. And so if you have a healthy, loving, attentive parent who's always there when you're hungry, thirsty, cold, your brain starts to connect all these attributes of human beings with being fed, with being regulated, with being safe. And then when you go out in the world and you enter school, you see a new human being, a teacher, your brain defaults to, oh, this is a person who's going to be safe and going to be rewarding and going to be kind. And those of you who know this field, this is what we call attachment. Attachment is basically a collection of memories created based upon your earliest developmental experiences with caregivers. And we do this with everything. Those of you interested in implicit bias, it's related to the creation of these associations earlier in your life. Now, I could go off on a whole tangent, which I won't. But the reason I wanted to talk to you about this is that the key point here is that the development of key areas in your brain will be experience dependent. So, if you are a child who hears a lot of words, in your household, by the time you're 2 years old, you will have a vocabulary of 100 words. Or this is a household where a low verbal environment, you'll have a 100-word vocabulary. If you are a 2-year-old and you have been raised in a high verbal environment, you may have a vocabulary as high as 600 words. Now, back to the one-size-fits-all model. We take kids that have come from low verbal environments and high verbal environments, and we put them in the same grade. And this begins to be an issue. And this is not, it's not just with regards to how verbal these kids are. We do this with all kinds of other capabilities. Some kids have fewer social experiences. Some kids have fewer motor experiences. But we put them all together because we're using a one-size-fits-all model of education. And the determinant of where we put a child in this educational track, for example, is based upon their chronological age, not their developmental age. So you're going to have all kinds of kids right here who have heard all these words before, and so when the teacher teaches to the mean, which is basically the only option that teacher has, you've got to teach to the mean because you've got 30 kids in the classroom. These kids will be bored, and these kids will be lost. Now just pay attention to this blue curve to start with. And so what you have is a teacher who is slowly moving the whole group forward. And the academic progress in this classroom is going to be typical. These kids down here were going to act out because they're lost. These kids are going to act out because they're bored. The teacher will spend 25% of his or her time managing that, and the whole group moves along slowly. This is why high-quality homeschooling, those kids move forward much faster. They can achieve academically much faster. Among there's other factors there, but that's one of the factors. Now, the thing I want you to focus on a little bit is this red group. The red group, that is kids who've grown up in environments where there is adversity, chaos, threat, housing insecurity, all the things that go with poverty create a climate of anxiety and unpredictability and tension. And because of that, either an overt adversity like a sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, exposure to community violence, those big T trauma or the little t trauma, both of those experiences, as I will talk about in a minute, literally make it harder for a child to learn. Because the first thing that happens when you are a young child or anybody exposed to threat is that you tend to shut down your cortex. Now, hold that for a minute. I'll come back and talk about that in a little bit more detail. But let me just go through this slide for 1 second, because if you understand this slide, you can understand ACEs. If you don't understand this slide, the correlation between early adversity and diabetes doesn't make any sense. I mean, you're like, what's the mechanism? How in the world does that influence the pancreas? And so the medical community for the longest time was highly skeptical of the ACE studies because they were not able in their brain to think of a mechanism by which early adversity, how is it that a kid who went through a divorce is going to have a higher probability of asthma? Tell me the mechanism. And the people who did this work didn't understand the mechanism because they're like, they weren't neuroscientists. They were a cardiologist and an internist, and they did not understand the neuroscience. But if you understand this slide, you will immediately understand ACEs. So let me just walk you through this. As I showed before, the brain has this hierarchy. There's these lower parts and the higher parts, and as you go from the functions mediated by different areas of the brain, you go from simpler functions up to these higher, more complex, most uniquely human functions. Now, think about it. Think about the complexity of getting 86 billion moving parts to work together in a synchronous way. It's a fundamental, complex challenge. It's really hard to do. And one of the neurobiological strategies, one of the microarchitectural strategies to help organize and integrate functioning across multiple parts of the brain is to have certain really, really important neural networks, not my head, slide please, thank you. Really, really important neural networks that originate in lower parts of the brain and then send direct connections to every other part of the brain. And so there are these fundamentally important regulatory networks that originate in the low part of the brain. And you've heard of most of them: norepinephrine, noradrenergic, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. And collectively, these neural networks go to every single part of the brain, and they also go out to every single organ in the body, both directly through the autonomic nervous system and indirectly through the neuroimmune system and the neuroendocrine system. And so this low part of your brain is essentially what we would call Grand Central Station. It is the backbone of the stress response. And I know those of you who've learned Trauma 101, you've learned all about cortisol and about the amygdala. And the amygdala has no direct input from the outside world. So the amygdala is part of this, right? But the amygdala acts because it gets input either top down from cortex or bottom up from these regulatory networks. This turns out to be incredibly important. It's incredibly important because anything that alters the organization and functioning of these neural networks will cause a cascade of vulnerability in every single part of the brain that they innervate and every single part of the body. i.e., this is why developmental adversity, which changes the sensitivity and reactivity of these neural networks, can influence your heart and your lung and your gut and your skin and your immune system and speech and language and your mood and anxiety. And so if you look at studies about developmental adversity, things that we know alter the sensitivity of these systems in ways that I'll show you in 1 minute, it's completely predictable that you'd expect these systems to be at increased risk for dysfunction. Not only is it not mysterious, it's completely predictable. And so it's no surprise then when somebody does a study and they look at, oh, people that have developmental adversity have a higher rate of difficulty with giving birth. They have a higher rate of eczema. They have higher rates of you can name any bad thing. Name any bad thing, and your probability for expressing that in adult life increases in a dose-dependent way with childhood adversity. So, 3 things that we know will, and adversity is not the only thing that can cause these systems to get messed up. 3 things that we know for sure will really, really influence these networks in a negative way and cause a cascade of problems. The first one is intrauterine insults, such as prenatal alcohol, prenatal meth, prenatal stress and distress of the mother will predictably alter the sensitivity and activity of these neural networks and lead to a cascade of problems that mimic the findings of the traditional ACE studies. The second thing is disruption of primary caregiving. If you have a mother who is the external stress regulator for the baby, and that mother is depressed, that mother's in a domestic violence relationship, that mother is high, absent, that anything that disrupts the ability of that caregiver to be present, attentive, attuned, and responsive to the baby leads to a pattern of dysregulation in the infant's stress response system, which then leads to a cascade of problems. And I'm going to come back and talk about how powerful that is in a moment. And then the third thing is what we would traditionally call adversity, these traumatic experiences. Now, because you are still paying attention, quite an attentive crowd, good for you. I'm going to tell you about the mechanism by which this happens. And I'm doing that at the risk of completely losing the audience. But I trust that you are engaged and you are going to find this useful. So here's what we're going to talk about. Well, let me do this first. All right, let me do this first. So this is the simple version of what happens to your brain when you get stressed. So if you remember that I had talked about these neural networks that were down here in these lower parts of the brain, right? And so when these lower parts of the brain, and what I didn't tell you was this. I mean, I probably should have, but I didn't. What I didn't tell you, and this is really important, is that every single visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, every single sensory thing that comes into your body to help you interpret and understand this moment, the first place that input comes is to the lowest and dumbest part of your brain. Now, the reason this is important is that so many of our interventions with dysregulated and acting out or behavioral problem kids in schools and in prisons and everything else has this weird idea that their behavior is motivated from top down, that they knew better and they still did it. And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the brain works. And so here's the way the brain works. This lowest part of your brain down here, the part of your brain that cannot tell time, this part of your brain, when information comes into that part of your brain can tell whether or not this is an experience as an infant or a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old. This is why a Vietnam vet, when they're 70 years old, they hear a car backfire, they can literally have a physiological response and feel like they need to take shelter. Because this part of the brain can't tell time. And earlier in that person's life, that part of the brain made an association between loud, unexpected noises and the need to take cover and threat and danger. And so that association still exists in his brain. And by the time the information gets to the part of his brain up here that can tell time, first of all, the reactive part of the brain has been able to act on that information. The emotional part of the brain has acted on that information. And now the rational part of the brain gets a chance to act on that information. But here's what happens. As soon as that information comes in, and here he is sitting relaxing with his grandchild, and somebody shoots a firecracker off in the base, in the backyard, within a millisecond, this is the way his brain works. He's activated a stress response. And the first thing that happens when you activate an intense stress response is that you deactivate certain parts of the cortex, including the part of the cortex that tells time. So he can get caught literally for a second or two in a loop where his brain feels like he's in Vietnam. That's what we call a flashback. And then as he sort of gets grounded and feels a little bit better, he starts to sort of open up a little bit more and then a little bit more. And then he realizes that, wow, I feel like this because somebody shot off a firecracker, those damn kids, blah, blah, blah. And he still feels crappy. But for that moment, and I don't know how many of you have ever had a moment like that, when you are in that state, a second or 2 seconds feels like a long time. Now, so the first thing that happens is that when you're threatened, or when your stress response system is activated, it starts to shut down your cortex. And when you're really, really, really activated, you literally get to the point where you're not even using cortical processing. You're sort of in the moment acting in these very self-preservation, almost animalistic-like ways. So when you have these kids that have these tantrums and these meltdowns, and they're on the floor crying and screaming and rocking, and all you wanted to do was have them do a transition, you're like, what in the hell? They act like you're going to kill them. Like, I'm not asking you to go to hell. I mean, we're not crossing the sticks here. We're just going to go into a different room for dinner. But to their brain, their brain feels like you really are going to do something very, very catastrophic to them. And their brain distorts the present. And this, again, is one of the biggest problems. These kids didn't make the plan that, when the mom comes and asks me to go have dinner, I'm going to have a major shitstorm. See how that goes over. They don't plan that. That's an elicited behavior. Just like when you accidentally touch a hot stove, you remove your hand before you even know what burned your finger. Human beings almost always behave before they think. And I know we have this fantasy about think before you behave. The reality is most of us behave before we think. So, let's back to this stress response thing a little bit here. Now, first thing I'm going to say is that I don't want you to be afraid of stress. Stress is actually good for you. Stress has gotten a really, really bad name. And I think the mental health field is really, bears a lot of that responsibility. It does. I mean, we've talked about stress like it's a bad thing. Stress is actually the best thing in the world. And I am honestly I'm not kidding or joking one bit. You cannot get better at anything unless you are stressed. You cannot develop if you are not stressed. You cannot learn a new thing unless you are stressed. You will not become resilient without stress. The key is the pattern of stress. And so if you have stressors that are unpredictable, you have no control over what's going on in your world. If you have stressors that are extreme or prolonged, you'll end up with an abnormally regulated stress response system that becomes overactive and overly reactive. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is where the good news is. If you understand the neurobiology of stress, what you immediately recognize is that there's a 30-year history in the neurosciences of showing us how to, number one, take an abnormally organized stress response system and make it more neurotypically organized, and number two, how to take a neurotypically organized stress response system and make it resilient. And it's through predictable, moderate, controllable stressors. The concept of is incredibly important to understand. Now, there's a couple of nuances to this that I may or may not get a chance to go into, but let me just walk you through something that it kind of, I think, explains this stuff. I'm going to, again, like I said, I'm going to show you some science. This is actually stuff that was from when I was 30 years ago when I was a neuroscience person. I did some of this work in animal models. But here's what I want you to just see. If you take an individual who's sort of pretty well regulated, at baseline they're not tuned up and they're not over anxious and they're not sort of completely shut down. They've got a neurotypical stress response capability. And you give them a moderate stress, like giving a presentation in front of the governor's wife, they're just saying, it's like, you have a moderate activation of your stress response. And so it will activate, it will get into this moderate activation level, and then at some point the presentation will be over and I'll get back to my baseline. Might take a beer or two, but I'll be fine. Just kidding. So, a couple weeks later, you can have another moderate stress. And everybody, in school, if you perform in sports, if you're in the school band, if you're in a play, you have these moderate stressor experiences. And these are good for you. Now, here's what happens. If you have a child who has a moderate stressor, they're neurotypically organized right here. And I'll give you an example. I could give thousands of examples. This is a pretty typical example. Little boy lives with his mom. When he was first, his father left when he was young. He loves school. Things have been fine at home. Mom has had a couple boyfriends in and out a little bit, but mostly dated, nothing really negative or toxic. So this is a neurotypically organized kid going to a typical public school. He's I think he's in the second grade, the child I'm thinking of. Comes home, does well on his test, has a moderate activation wants to perform well, kind of gets a little bit nervous about it, does okay. On his way home, before he gets back to his baseline, he sees a pair of men's shoes sitting outside the back door. And that's a little bit unfamiliar. And one thing I didn't say is that unfamiliar cues, novelty, activates your stress response, even if it's just a little bit. But see, when it activates just a little bit on the heels of being tuned up, what will happen is this will be your response. And he walks in the door and he sees a man who scowls at him. A strange man sitting at a kitchen table with his mom, scowls at him, and he hasn't gotten back to baseline, and he's a little bit uncomfortable, and the guy says something like, "What is he doing here?" in a hostile way. And she says, "This is my son. He's coming home from school." And he's not happy about that because he thought he was going to get lucky, and here comes this kid. And so the little boy goes back into his room. He's like, "What's going on? This guy was mean." And then he hears yelling because mom was trying to defend the little boy. He goes out into the kitchen, and he's really scared now, and he tries to stand up for his mom, and the guy scowls at him and says, "Get out of here," and then hits his, sort of is rough with his mom, doesn't really hit her, but all of this stuff gets him into this state. He's fearful. And then the guy spends the night, and the kid goes back to school and has another test the next day. And in a subject where he would normally get an A, this kid didn't even finish all of the answers. This is a sensitizing pattern of stress activation, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And this happens to kids that live in environments where there's poverty, where there's community violence, where there's housing insecurity, food insecurity. And so what happens is, as this system gets more and more activated, this is what happens. You begin to lose the normal linear relationship between external threat or external challenge and internal response. I'm about to describe for you mechanisms that underlie the achievement gap. The achievement gap isn't about the color of your skin. It's about the degree of distress in your world. And so here's a child. This is you and I, maybe. We have a little bit of moderate stress, which is completely predictable in work or school. We're able to stay active alert. We still have access to lots of our cortex. We can internalize new content. We can retrieve old content. So we do just fine in a workplace. We do just fine in the classroom. But if you have been this child or adult who has a sensitized stress response, you have the typical challenges of work or school, and your brain basically is walking around like you're under threat, which means that you're not using all of your cortex, which means that you will learn, but you'll learn at a much slower rate than other kids. You'll need 4 repetitions to master the same stuff that other kids get in 2 repetitions. And pretty soon you fall further and further behind. This is showing you the same thing. Whoops. Basically, what will happen is optimal development, optimal teaching, optimal parenting, optimal therapy requires leaving your comfort zone, getting into this Goldilocks place where there's not too much stress, but there's enough stress. And this is what healthy development is all about. This is what, if you're interested in competition in sports, in fact, we work with a lot of athletes and athletic teams about stuff like this. You want to get better at competition, you've got to practice at speed with moderate stressor. It's not the same as the game, but you've got to have enough stressors so that you actually begin to develop resilience for those conditions. But what happens with these poor kids that we work with, and many of you work with, if they're sensitized, a dose that's completely appropriate for this child is an overwhelming dose for this child. And so what education and therapy becomes is understanding these concepts of dosing and spacing. Now, one of the things that I'm actually very happy about being in Arizona today about is that we are about to start a large project with the Arizona Board of Education about introducing some of these concepts about trauma, understanding trauma, and helping create more developmentally aware environments in classrooms so educators can better understand how to dose and space in ways that can help these kids catch up and in ways that will minimize behavioral acting out that will inevitably arise from a child who is in a fight or flight state. So, now, talked a little bit about this. Let me talk about the good news. Here's the good news. Because of the malleability of the brain, the very same pattern of neural activity, the very same systems that underlie sensitivity are going to be responsive to this is labeled a resilience building pattern, but this is also a therapeutic pattern if you're tuned up, right? So if you're dysregulated and hypersensitive and overly reactive, you want that to change. So here's what we know, is that if you take an individual who is tuned up and they're dysregulated right here, like these kids I showed earlier, and you give them a moderate dose, it's completely overwhelming and they melt down, it's a disaster. They melt down, they either flee or they fight or they shut down. It's not good. But if there's a tolerable dose of challenge and there's an adequate spacing for them to kind of get back to their baseline, and then you have another opportunity for them to determine what the moderate dose of challenge is, these kids can ultimately start to have neurotypical organization. And so that a child who is sensitized, if they have moderate, predictable, controllable doses, can heal and then ultimately become resilient. Now, what are the essential elements of this? What is one of these things? Just keep that question in mind, and I'm going to show you a little science here, some other research here. First of all, I would like to thank you guys. You're very attentive for sitting for so long. You're either that or you're the best dissociators in the planet. Probably a combination of both. All right. So let me just take a minute and talk about this. There's two things I want to talk about. One is that, and it's related to the work that we've done with the people who did the original ACE study. And I'll find that in here in a minute. We have had the good fortune of having lots of good working relationships with colleagues all over the world. As I said before, we're part of this big network, and one of the things that we've been able to do is have these wonderful, productive, collaborative partnerships and relationships. And I've written an article about the mechanisms that may underlie the observations from the ACE studies, and I wrote it with the authors of the ACE study. And so, you all know that here are the 10 adversities that were part of that epidemiological study. And again, I just want to emphasize that the ACE inventory it can be a really useful thing for looking at epidemiological sort of correlations. And so, oops. I don't know. Let me get rid of that. I don't know why that's there. I'm sure I did something wrong here. Maybe I should. Oh, it did? Well, let me just make it go away for sure. Okay. All right. I think I made it go away for sure. All right. So the original ACE study, as you know, had these, or may not know, but those of you who do know, those of you who don't know, there are these 10 items. And what they do is they take a bunch of adults, at least in the original study, and say, hey, did any of these things happen to you any time in your life? And those of you who are clinicians know that that's kind of a broad question. Like not a lot of specificity about, when did it happen? How many times did it happen? Just if it happened, you endorse it and you get a check. And so when you do that, you get this really, really powerful dose-dependent relationship between your ACE score and then bad things in adult life. And so when I say bad things, this is what, like I said earlier, if you look at physical health problems, suicidality, substance abuse, mental health problems, etc., literally any bad thing. So the more adverse experiences you have, the more at risk you are for manifesting multiple of these bad outcomes. Now, being a clinician and knowing a lot about development of the brain, I knew that there were a couple of things here that the ACE study was not honing in on that are really important. Number one is, I know that there are people who had bad things happen to them and they're actually functioning relatively well. And I know people that didn't have that many bad things, if at all, happen to them, and they're really struggling. So I know that, number one, your ACE score is not this inevitability. It's not, these studies don't determine causality. It's about risk. Your risk changes. And so one of the things that I knew was really important in our work that we'd seen was that connectedness, relationships made a big difference. And so here's what we did. We went back and we started to look at people who had adversity, and then we looked at how connected they were. If people had a history of being connected to others, healthy relationships in the family, healthy relationships in school, community, healthy connection to culture, those individuals were to some degree buffered from the impact of adversity. So if you could have as many as 4 ACE items endorsed, but if you had relational wealth, you didn't begin to demonstrate risk until you got over 4. In contrast, if you had no ACE items, but you had relational poverty, disconnection from family, disconnection from culture, disconnection from community, you were at risk for demonstrating 2 of these bad outcomes. Now, one of the things that we've done over the years is develop this model to look at the timing and the nature of developmental adversity and the timing and the nature of developmental health. And we have built a network of clinicians and clinical teams all over the world who have learned how to do an assessment as part of their clinical work that looks at the timing and the nature of bad things and the timing and the nature of these relational health items. And we look at them as a function of these different age groups, intrauterine, the first 2 months of life, the first year of life, and so forth. So we're able to look at not only the timing of adversity, but we're able to look at the timing of these relational health items. And so let me just show you a few things that we found. One of the things that we found, and I'm just going to say it, I'm not going to show it because it's, it's just too much science. Not that you couldn't do it. I just don't have enough time. It's me, not you. So what we basically found was that when you were, and this isn't what this graph is about, but what we basically found was when you look at risk for bad outcomes, that your history of developmental connectedness is a better predictor than your history of adversity. And I think anybody who does clinical work has seen that. And those of you who think about the people you know in your life who are struggling the most and the people that have had hard things and are doing okay, you'll start to do the math. You'll see the same thing. People that have had other people connected in an enduring way in their life do better. Now, here's the other thing that we found, and this is a very sobering thing. And on one hand, it's very positive, and on one hand, it's very challenging. So let me just explain it, and then we'll talk through it. So the first thing that we do with this measure that we have is, as I said, we have a way to measure adversity, and we have a way to measure this relational health thing. And so the balance between these two gives us what we call the developmental risk factor. So if you have a lot of bad things and no relational buffer, that's high developmental risk. And if you have lots of connectedness and no adversity, that's low developmental risk. Make sense? Okay. So then we took a group, and we've done this with kids, we've done this with adults, we've done this with teens, we've done this with children 11 to 13, but we're using the 11 to 13 because we published this, and it's a big N number. So we looked at a bunch of kids that are 11 to 13, and we measured their current functioning. And basically, we have a way to sum up their functioning using this total score. And it's basically a measure of how well organized and functioning various brain-mediated things are. Attention, mood regulation, fine motor control, and so forth. Stuff that in the mental health field, you kind of know what I'm talking about. So here's what we did. If you take the group that had low development, now these are all kids that are in a clinical population. They presented to one of our, we have got 2,500 clinicians all over the world using this model. So they presented to one of our several hundred sites across the world to get help. So they're a clinical population. These aren't neurotypical individuals. So if they had low developmental risk from birth forward, they had a score in this brain sort of function category that was about 70% of what you would expect in neurotypical kids, which is not great, but it's, that's what we got. And that's probably why they were presenting for mental health services. So if you took a group that had high developmental risk in the first 2 months of life and then all the way until they were 11 to 13, this is their score. They were about 54% of functioning of a neurotypical kid. So they had more dysfunction in more systems. Now here's the interesting stuff. And it fits completely with what we know about how the brain develops, but it's a very sobering thing to see. If you take the group of kids who had high risk in the first 2 months of life and then were removed, and almost all of these are a groups of kids that entered our foster care systems or were adopted. Now, let me just show you what we see. Their score is essentially the same as if there'd been adversity through the whole time period, which is pretty sobering, right? Now, anybody who works in this field knows this. You see this. You can see kids that were adopted by wonderful parents at 2 months, and these kids end up having reading problems, attention problems, behavior problems, social problems. It's like, what the hell? And in part, this is because the first 2 months of life are so crucial for organizing these stress response systems I've been talking about, and because they're involved in so many functions. As you get older, these systems play a major role in organizing these other upstream systems that have to do with thinking and feeling and behaving and so forth. Here's what I want to tell you. I am completely convinced that when our child welfare systems and foster homes and mental health communities become more trauma-informed, that will not be the same finding. But that's why that number is low, I think, currently. Now, here's the good news. Kids that had the first 2 months of life with low developmental risk and then the wheels fell off their family, their outcomes were as good as the kids who had low developmental risk all the way through. This speaks very, very strongly for the wisdom of aggressive early intervention programs for both pregnant and then early childhood programming with young parents who have young kids. You literally, if a parent, at least from this, in the first 2 months, if there is an adequate level of attention and attunement and responsivity to the infant, that has an inoculating impact that protects these kids from tremendous developmental risk for the next 10 years. This is, again, very consistent with the findings of people that study high-quality home visitation models. And this, if you want bang for your buck, this is a really important finding. Now, this isn't with a few kids. This is a study on over 6,000 kids, and we've replicated this now with 10,000 kids. We've got, like I said, we have clinicians all over the world that are adding to this core data set, and we have an N right now of over 50,000 kids. And as we continue to build that, we'll be able to look more carefully at some of the nuances related to this. But this is, in my mind, the most hopeful finding of our work. And what it really speaks to is this, is that, you know, independent of your model, independent of your evidence-based practice, if you are able to create a relational connection to the child and to the people who care for the child, the parent, the teacher, the early child care provider, if they can stay regulated, they can help these children in ways that will have enduring impact. It will decrease their risk for school problems. It'll decrease their risk for mental health problems. It'll decrease the probability they enter the juvenile justice system. And despite the fact that we are having these one-size-fits-all models, they'll be able to do better. And so back to this whole one-size-fits-all model thing, these are the kids that have these, begin to have the achievement gap because they're from chaos, stress, distress, threat. And what will happen is they're chronologically 5, but because their cortex has been relatively shut down, even if they're hearing words, they're not internalizing them the same way. But we tend to be pretty bad at looking at individuals, kids as individuals. And so this is what happens. This is what happens with things that we even measure. So if you start to fall behind, we're terrible at catching you up. This is with stuff that we measure in it and that we're teaching to and that we are explicitly valuing. But think about what happens with things that we aren't measuring and that we aren't explicitly valuing, like the ability to form and maintain relationships, the capacity to be empathic, the capacity for self-regulation. We don't measure those things in ways, in a systematic way. So here's what happens. These kids that fall behind start to get these labels. We view them through the lens of mental health. And the traditional mental health world does not understand developmental trauma. We tend to give them multiple diagnostic labels. We tend to use medications. And if that medication doesn't work, we add another medication. And so we have this crisis of poor psychopharmacology practice, particularly in kids in foster care, where they get over-medicated, the medications are ineffective. We're reassured by the people who have the highest doctoral degrees that this is the right thing. And the irony is, in the evidence-based world, these people are practicing in ways where there's not a shred of evidence. I can guarantee you there's not a shred of evidence that any of the psychotropic drugs that we use on a routine basis with these kids have been effectively shown to be useful or effective in kids that have complex trauma. In large part because the studies we use to track this stuff, we exclude those complex kids from those studies. What we do know is that if you give kids those medications like Risperdal and other antipsychotic medications, you increase their risk for cardiometabolic problems. So again, it's one of these things where it's well-intended, but it's developmentally ignorant. It's neuroscience ignorant. We're making kids get diabetes from our intervention as opposed to have decreased impulse control. And then if you're a child of color, this is what happens. The very same kids that were struggling in pre-K and accumulate diagnostic labels. You know, this kid I showed you before, the kid who murdered all these people? He'd had 12 different mental health evaluations and been given 15 different neuropsychiatric diagnoses and had been tried on over 20 medications. And then he got old enough that his disruptive behaviors, his fight or flight behaviors, were pathologized and then criminalized. And so when he tried to leave a classroom and a teacher put hands on him and he resisted and the teacher got hurt, he was charged with assault. If somebody goes up to you on the street and grabs your arm and tries to stop you from walking, they're the person that we charge with assault. Our misunderstanding of these kids is feeding the school to prison pipeline.
Oh.
Thank you. If nominated, I will not run, and if elected, I will not serve. That's an old Lyndon Johnson joke for those of you. Anyway, all right. So the good news is that this doesn't have to be. You know, we've seen in many, many places that when schools and teachers, teachers want to help these kids. When they are armed with the knowledge about what these behaviors are about, when they're given strategies to regulate these kids instead of just punish them, we see incredibly different outcomes. I could give you a whole bunch of other data, but one of my favorite stories is from an elementary school in Columbus, Ohio, where there were kids in that community, 50% of them the year before had been homeless at some point, and it was a very poor community. This one sticks out because I just could not believe the number of kids, the numbers I was hearing. So this school had 2,000 referrals to the principal's office. Think about it, in elementary school, and only 5% of these kids achieved the Ohio academic standard testing, competence levels that were expected for their third graders. 1 year after bringing in some of these concepts, the number of visits to the principal went down to 200, and the number of kids in the third grade that passed the competency test was 58%. And we're seeing the same thing in Tasmania, Scotland, South Africa, all throughout North America. When you give well-intended, bright people the right knowledge base and a few tools, they take their own creativity, they take their own energy, they take their own efforts, and they make positive change. And we've seen this happen in child welfare settings, mental health settings, juvenile justice settings, early childhood settings, education settings, and we are, because of that, hopeful. And I think that one of the things that you're going to see in this community, every person who spoke alluded to the growth of awareness about these concepts. I can tell you right now that in this state, there are many, many, many very good initiatives underway that are helping spread these concepts. And I'm confident, particularly with the support of the governor and the governor's wife and all of this senior leadership and in your major departments that live and work with kids, that you're going to not only be able to make these changes, I'm pretty confident you're going to be able to invent new ways to do this work. Because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take places like this who have the intention and the relationships to start to think about problem solving in a different way. This isn't about having, new font or a new department name, or finding an evidence-based program to make everybody have. The reality is our evidence base is scant in child mental health. We need to have evidence-generating practice so that we learn from what we're doing. And as we learn, we self-correct. And once we start to do that, the rate at which we can make new innovations is going to be accelerated. And I think that this is the kind of place where that can happen. And I am grateful for the opportunity to be part of some of those initiatives in this state. And I would just encourage all of you to not give up, not get too discouraged by the inevitable roadblocks that you will see. Roadblocks, just cross the road, so do a little cross-country work and get around the roadblocks. It reminds me of a story. I was working with the FBI on this thing. There was a bank robbery, and then there was a high-speed chase, and the police had set up a roadblock in the cul-de-sac. And so here they were telling me about this. I was doing a debriefing of a shooting that happened there, and they were talking, the police officers were just so surprised that these people who had robbed the bank and shot a bunch of people dared to drive over the lawns. Oh, Jesus. I was like, shocking. Thought putting the car right at the end of the cul-de-sac. We got them now. They came speeding down the road. They saw the roadblock, and they're like, oh, they just went over the lawns. They're like, what? Whoa. Anyway, so on that note, I want to thank you for your attention, your work, and I look forward to hearing about how you make progress over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Thank you so much. We are so lucky to have Dr. Perry here with us today to share all of this wonderful information, all of this research, create this kind of baseline knowledge and shared knowledge. I'll share my favorite class in grad school was neurobiology, little known fact, so I'm absolutely nerd out about all of this. So I'm very grateful. We're going to take a very short break to set up for our plenary panel, so stretch your legs and come back quickly because Mrs. Ducey is going to lead us down a road in conversation of with our agencies and Casey Family Programs about how we're serving kids and what else we could be doing next. But thank you again, Dr. Perry, and to everyone for being attentive and engaged, and we will be right back. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started now with our panel.
What else?
Is my mic working? Everyone can hear me? It works, right? I'm going to assume everyone can hear me and say good morning again to everyone. And thank you for sticking around with us and being here today. I want to welcome Mrs. Ducey back to the stage. And to help us moderate today's panel. So we have, we have a very illustrious panel of all women doctors. Yay. That's right. Cheers. So that was not the intent. They're not here because they are women who are doctors, but it just worked out that way, and I just love that fact. So before we get into it, I'm going to introduce everyone to you. Dr. Kara Christ currently serves as the director of the Arizona Department of Health Services, where she leads a dynamic team responsible for Arizona's public health system. So welcome, Dr. Christ. Dr. Jackie Contreras is a Casey Family Programs Managing Director for California and Arizona. She leads policy and practice efforts across those states and nationally to improve the well-being of vulnerable families. Welcome, Dr. Contreras. Dr. Sarah Park is the Chief Medical Officer at the Arizona Department of Child Safety. Dr. Park advocates for children through the department's program for children in out-of-home care. Welcome. And we also have Dr. Sarah Salick, the Chief Medical Officer of the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System, also known as ACCESS, where she oversees all of the clinical operations. Welcome, Dr. Salick. I'm very happy to have you all joining us here today.
Yes, and thank you, everyone, for sticking around for this part. I've never done this before, so just bear with me. I usually just like to direct my children what to do without any feedback. So I'll try to adjust that. But as you all heard earlier, this work is very near and dear and personal to my heart. So I am so grateful for all of you sticking around to hear all these wonderful experts that we are so privileged to have in the state of Arizona serving our population and doing this work on ACEs and being trauma-informed and supporting our vulnerable populations. I also want to just say I'm grateful, too, for the non-traditional, not just the agencies, but all of the non-traditional, whether you're here with your church or you're here with your tribal nation. We're just grateful for all of the community partners, too. And just to get started, I would like to ask each one of you, and we'll start with Dr. Chris, to share with us some of the populations that you do serve in your agencies.
So as the state's Department of Public Health, we actually touch all 7 million Arizonans, but have specific touch points with vulnerable populations from birth all the way to death. And so we operate the state's highest acuity mental health facility in Arizona. So those are going to be our vulnerable, seriously mentally ill. We also regulate hospitals and child care facilities. So patients that are receiving treatment or children in child care settings, we will respond to those types of emergencies. We also touch at-risk families through our home visiting program that we partner with DCS and DES and a lot of you out in the community as well. And then there's a lot of other things that we touch Arizonans on, whether it's responding to traumas by regulating EMS and paramedics, working with pregnant moms and children between the ages of 1 and 5 with the Women, Infants, and Children's program. So we have a lot of interesting touch points.
And Dr. Contreras?
Please, thank you. So I am with Casey Family Programs. We are a national operating foundation, so we work with all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We also work with a number of tribes across the country. And here, there are 4 tribes in Arizona that we work closely with: Gila River, Salt River, Pima Maricopa Indian Community, Navajo Nation, and Pasquayaqui. We also provide direct service in 5 states, and so we have a office here in Phoenix, and we also have a small satellite in the Tucson area. And in our direct service, we work primarily with children in or associated with the child welfare system. Very often, these are youth who have been in care a number of years. 2+ years is not unusual, or even more. We work with older youth. We find that older youth in particular have challenges around achieving permanency. And we work with in-home services, so hopefully preventing reentries into care is our primary focus here in Arizona. And we also provide services to young adults who have either aged out of the system or are transitioning into adulthood. And in all of these populations, we find that many of them suffer from complex trauma, not only the youth themselves, but their families as well. And so we really see our work about helping them to deal with that complex trauma and also helping them on their path to healing.
Dr. Park?
Hi. So as a CMO at DCS, I have, so let me just explain a little bit about the health plan for children in foster care. It is the only health plan in the country that is actually housed within the Department of Child Safety. And it is dedicated only to children in out-of-home care. So that's a little unusual compared to the rest of the states in the country. And so we serve all the children that have been removed from their homes and placed in out-of-home care. The department also provides services to vulnerable children or children where we're trying to prevent them from coming into DCS care with preventative services as well. And so these are all the at-risk youth, children or youth who have been referred to the department.
Hi, good morning. Great to be here. Thank you for hosting this really important panel, and feel very privileged to be working amongst professional women in leadership positions. And so thank you for acknowledging that. And so I am actually the Chief Medical Officer for the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System. So it's access with 3 C's. And so it's basically Arizona's Medicaid system. And right now we serve over 1.8 million Arizonans through our Medicaid program, in part based off of restoration and expansion, which includes about 400,000 individuals that previously did not have health care coverage. And so really the efforts of Governor Brewer at the time to restore and expand Medicaid. In addition to our Medicaid program, we also merged with the Division of Behavioral Health Services, and we're the state mental health authority, and also oversee our federal block grants, which include our mental health block grant as well as our substance abuse block grant. And we also oversee our state funding. So another really wonderful thing about the state of Arizona is that we do have state funding for individuals who have serious mental illness but don't qualify for Medicaid. And so we serve individuals in our state through those state funds. The one thing that I wanted to note, several things I wanted to note, is that the vast majority of children in foster care in Arizona are covered through Medicaid, and so we have just shy of 13,000 kids in our Medicaid program that are in CMDP, which Dr. Park oversees. And so, we'll go into a little bit more detail in regards to some of the partnership in regards to addressing adverse childhood experiences.
Thank you. Oh, I'd like to start with Dr. Park and Dr. Contreras. As we look at adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how potential foster families or kinship families or caregivers, those that are spending the most time with those kiddos in foster care, how are they being trained? I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, very just sort of glossed over maybe about 5 years ago. I know a lot of work has been done. So how are we preparing those that are going to care for those children?
So the Department of Child Safety has actually had a program for over a year now, actually Dr. Bruce Perry's program, the neurosequential model of addressing trauma for kinship families that they've had and rolled out over the last year with monthly opportunities that are provided to both kinship and other foster families to participate and learn everything that we just heard about this morning. And I believe it's a 3-year program to try to create a curriculum, to develop some trainers who can facilitate those programs, as well as case-based scenarios that families can relate to learn how to manage children who have had a lot of trauma. That's the beginning. I'm sure there's a lot more that we can go to. If there's one thing that we've learned in medicine, it's that you're never done, you're never finished, and there's always more to learn and more to do. And things change. So it will be an evolving approach, I believe so.
So this is something that we recognize is really vital if this work is going to be successful. Caregivers, birth parents, kinship caregivers, adoptive parents, they spend the majority of time with these children. And you heard Dr. Perry talk about the fact that the repetitiveness that's needed, and in order to help these children to heal from the trauma that they've experienced, is so important. And so we see in our direct service work, we see our foster parents as vital partners. In this work, we provide education, sort of education around trauma and what some of the strategies are that they can employ in order to effectively support youth in their care. The training is very engaging of the foster parents, so we really try to make sure that we're listening to what are the challenges, the real life challenges, so that it's applicable to the work that they're doing day in and day out. We have this one great mnemonic that our trainers use. It's called Q-tip, and it stands for quit taking it personally. And that simple little mnemonic has been one of the most powerful things for parents and even professionals to hear, to remind themselves that this is not about them, that all of the things that have happened to this young person or to this family are things that they need to be able to stay focused on. We also do a lot of work around helping both the caregivers and professionals to think about their own trauma experience, because that comes into play as well as they're trying to provide supports to children and families.
Thank you.
Sorry, you always will have, at some point, some technological event.
That's me. I probably
so
did
of course it's happening to my first lady, but okay.
But to add to Jackie's point, when we're dealing with children who are either in foster care or at risk, the goal is to train the village, right? If you can empower the village to understand, recognize trauma, and approach it, then everybody around that child can help that child, including that child's parents, in order to try to prevent them from coming into DCS custody.
And I was just going to say, I think that's the important part of being here today. Just during the break, I was speaking with a lovely mom, Imelda, who adopted her son out of foster care. And,
struggling with teachers to understand the trauma that he's been through.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of work to still do.
And so the next couple of questions kind of flow together, but I was curious, Dr. Salek, if you could share with us a bit about what you think in terms of the transformation of services to become trauma-informed, what you think are the greatest strengths in your field, and then I was hoping Dr. Contreras could share a little bit of that same vein for just child welfare generally.
Yeah, so if I had one take-home point to make in regards to being trauma-informed, it's really around being a strengths-based system of care. And so we've really evolved from kind of a blame and shame, and I think that's what many of the others were mentioning in regards to normalizing and being able to address complex trauma issues. And so when we look at risk factors, whether that's substance use disorder or mental health, is to be able to talk about it openly, just like we would with any other healthcare condition. And so the efforts of our Arizona Medicaid system to really link the head with the rest of the body through our integration efforts, both at the payer level as well as the provider level, are helping bridge that gap. And again, starting to normalize the conversation around topics that in the past and currently still have a lot of social stigma associated with it, and blame and shame and a lot of judgment. And so I think really within leadership of state government, to continue to discuss the challenges that families serve rather than lay blame, to really understand the complex biopsychosocial issues that our families are serving and really partner with them, communicate, form relationships. So the other aspect of my job that I love and a critical aspect is the relationships I not only have at Access, the state Medicaid agency, and working with wonderful people that are dedicated to the cause, but also to be able to work across agencies to collaborate what's in the best interest of our children and families.
Thank you.
So I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I can tell you that I learned very little about trauma in all of my years of study. And so my opportunity to learn about trauma has come through the child welfare system. And we were fortunate in our organization to work early on with Dr. Perry on the neurosequential model of therapeutics, and it's really impacted the way that we see the children and families that we work with and the work that we're doing. So I want to answer that question sort of from the perspective of social work. I often say I'm a wannabe social worker at heart. I sort of missed that turn somewhere along the line. But there are 6 core values to social work, and I was originally just going to highlight one because it's the one that I think about most often, and that is the core value of social justice. And I looked them up last night to see, well, what are the other ones? And I thought they were very telling, because I think sometimes what happens in this work is we look for the next evidence-based model, the next project, the next answer to what the question is, and we forget what we already know. And so I just want to highlight what those are. The first is service, social justice, dignity and worth of the individual, importance and centrality of human relationships, integrity, and competence. And so I really feel strongly that from the perspective of social work and being reminded of those values and really thinking about how we interact with one another and with children and families, there's a lot that we can accomplish just by the care and the compassion that we can show to one another.
So I'm going to ask a question of Dr. Chris and Dr. Contreras, but we'll start with Dr. Chris. We know that any significant system transformation comes with challenges. What do you think we need to be mindful of most as we move forward in this work?
I think that there's a couple of things that we should be mindful of as we move forward. One is that we are going to be changing a culture, and that's going to take some time. And so giving those that help us, those that partner with us, those that work with us, the tools and resources that they need in order to be able to make that culture shift and to be able to work with their clients and stakeholders. I think the other thing, though, that we need to build, that we've identified at the department, you can find an at-risk family or you can find somebody who needs help, needs referrals to services. And what we're finding is that we don't have enough services to go around to make those referrals, especially out in our rural and our frontier counties. And so you have this family that you know that if you could wrap around those services and get them in touch with what they need, you might be able to prevent either a bad outcome or help them have a more successful outcome. But it's hard to identify that because, as we're finding, a lot of families need those resources.
And I would highlight a couple of things. One is that as we've worked in our organization and looked at a culture shift in the way that we do our work, when our direct services started, we primarily provided long-term foster care and then shifted into really much more of a permanency focus. And so we've seen a significant shift in our culture. There's four levels, if you will, that we've tried to attend to make sure that culture shift, that shift is really sustainable and lasting. The first is that we need to think about from an individual level sort of what is needed. So what do workers need, what do foster parents need in order to be able to make those shifts? What's the toolkit that we can help them to develop in order to utilize those resources effectively when they're needed? The second is on the interpersonal level. So what happens when you actually interact with a child and family? We like to ask the question internally, how will a child or family know that we're trauma-informed? How is your behavior actually going to change, and how do we attend to that? To that end, we provide a lot of coaching. We recognize that training is not enough, really helping transfer of skills. Coaching is really important in order to be able to do that. The third level is at an organizational level. So we really try to look at what are our policies and procedures. If we say a family's voice is important, do we have procedures that actually allow for them to have the time, right, to be able, and to lift up that voice and to be a part of the process? And then the last is cultural. Are there things that we need to attend to? What are the underlying beliefs about families? Or those types of things, even if you do all the other three, still getting in the way of our ability to be effective? I think the other piece that's really important to pull out is workforce. We have to pay attention to our workforce, right? The work that we ask people to do day in and day out is incredibly demanding. And so how do we make sure that they have the support that they need to do the work effectively? And we find that supervisors in particular play an incredibly important role in that regard. So making sure that we're attending to that.
And you make a critical point of the workforce, which is a beautiful segue to the next question that we had, which is when we talk about trauma and populations that we serve who have high ACEs, high trauma, it's always been on the forefront of my mind, probably because Dr. Contreras is how I learned about trauma-informed care in the first place, but the workforce. And we have a public safety workforce to include DCS. We have service providers that interact with all these folks. And so how do we protect against vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, which is so critical both to protect our folks and ourselves, but to better serve. So I was hoping, Dr. Park, and I know we're going to talk about this more in depth in a breakout this afternoon, if you could talk a little bit about the amazing body of work that DCS has taken on with this in mind.
It's not just targeted to the people that work at DCS, but DCS's entire vision and their approach to addressing all aspects of our care, their Safe Easy model, which looks at reasons for why children come in, assessing them appropriately, using care coordination in being transparent about it, using evidence-based models, and in partnership with both the families, kinship, extended families. I think that entire philosophy of how we approach children who potentially are going to come into our care is a big part of that. Within DCS, they have a resiliency program and are working with all of us that work for DCS, because we understand that there is trauma that people are exposed to. And we may think of it just as the front line. That is, of course, the most evident part of it, but it occurs in other parts of DCS as well. And DCS has a program, a peer program, where they help address all of these. Their approach in assessing or responding to critical events as well is trauma-enforced, and Director McKay comes and visits his folk out in the field when they have significant events. So, I think from the top down, our leadership has demonstrated that and is putting things in place. Are we perfect? Are we there? Do we have it all? No, but we're working.
And Dr. Christ and Dr. Contreras, sadly we know that many of our systems, our response comes in after children experience trauma or ACEs. What do you think are some things that we can put in play to prevent and before we get to dealing with ACEs?
Oh, sure. So I can go first. So prevention as a public health professional is one of the things that we really love. We would love to be able to stave off a lot of things by preventing those bad outcomes. I think that utilizing every opportunity when we, as at least a governmental entity, have a touch point with the citizens. So remembering to be trauma-informed, encouraging or ensuring that all of our employees that are working with them understand, again, that Q-tip process. Don't take it personally. I think that's phenomenal. But then engaging with them and ensuring that we're getting them in there. And then as we're working with those populations that may not have had the trauma yet, but may be more at risk, really trying to get them the tools and resources to provide that resilience and give parents so that they can recognize what's going on, give them the tools that they need in order to help provide that protective factor around those children. And again, I can't stress the workforce enough. There's a phenomenal video that the Cleveland Clinic put out on empathy and how you might react to somebody if you knew what was going on through their mind. And it's run by the Cleveland Clinic. You can see it on YouTube, but we've been trying to show that to our staff. Like, everybody has something different going on, and you may not understand why they're reacting. And then we're engaging kind of in the happiness advantage. And so we're looking at different ways to ensure that our team has resilience, the tools they need for self-care, so that then they can portray that and help with that protective effect.
So I think there's a lot of work that you're already doing. I mean, it's incredibly impressive to hear about the partnerships that exist, the things that are happening within agencies, across agencies, and I think also the community that's here and present and wanting to kind of figure some of this out and figure out how to move forward. So I think that goes a long way in terms of moving an agenda. Across the country, there's a number of jurisdictions that are employing strategies to be more preventative in nature. So the no wrong door concept, right? When a family comes to help, they don't have to wait sequentially, right, to get worse in order to access services, but we figure out kind of what is needed at that point. There are lots of approaches around resource centers, really turning sort of community centers or schools into resource centers that families can sort of naturally access before a child is actually harmed, and we can bring those services more upstream. I think probably the most, and Janet Garcia, who runs our Phoenix office here, would not be happy with me if I did not mention Family First. And I think the new legislation is an incredible opportunity to begin to think about how funds can be used for children who are at risk of coming into the child welfare system, for pregnant and parenting youth who are in foster care, and for their families, whether those are their birth parents or adoptive parents or their kin, to really think about how can in many instances, evidence-based services be provided up front in the areas of mental health, substance abuse, in-home parenting. I think the nurse partnership program that Dr. Perry highlighted is really vital to think about how can that potentially be provided. And I don't mean to suggest that it's a panacea to sort of all of the problems. There's certainly complexities around the legislation. There's complexities about how it intersects with what you're doing here in Arizona, and I think jurisdictions across the country are really grappling with that because they recognize that this is an incredible opportunity, right, to provide those preventative services.
Dr. Park, anything to add?
I think that I'm just going to echo what everybody else has said, that the work is being done. It has begun already. I will tell you that we probably need to work a lot more on our providers on the physical health side. Though when I was in practice, we had the same kind of video that we tried to bring into our for all of our staff on the physical health side, so that they would respond and they would understand that the person walking down the hall, or the person who came into your registration area was mean and rude to you, but why was that? And how do we react to that? So I think there's a lot of work still yet to be done for us to get there, but it's happening, and it's very encouraging that it has begun, and a testament to all of that is all of you that are here that are willing to partake in that.
We've talked a lot this morning about the importance of partnership and collaboration and stakeholders and various stakeholders. And one part of policy in the universe, which is why this panel is awesome and intimidating to me, has always been health policy. I worked really hard to stay on the HS side of HHS in my career. So with Dr. Salek here and Dr. Park, there's been a lot of changes and shifts within access, and you touched on it a little bit, and there's the changes with CMDP and the uniqueness of that. I think it would be great if you can touch a little bit more on that, how that works, how you work together to serve our kids, what are the benefits, how are we trauma informed, what are the challenges. I could have written this all down for you, but
yes.
I didn't.
No, I got it.
You got
I'm
so
happy.
they're doctors.
Yeah, I'm happy to start and then hand it over to Dr. Park. And so, I think first and foremost, we have a shared mission in regards to serving our children and families, because we know that they're the cornerstone to Arizona. And so I feel very fortunate to work with leadership across state agencies, including DCS. It's not uncommon that I'll have daily, multiple times a day, communications with DCS leadership in regards to serving our youth and families. And so part of I think, Maria, you had mentioned around part of the system changes that I will further explain, since it does, our healthcare system infrastructure has changed with the times, which one of those changes is around healthcare integration, meaning that historically within the Medicaid system here in Arizona, we've been a carved out system, meaning that Medicaid contracted with different health plans to serve the physical health needs of our families, and a separate health plan for the behavioral health needs of our families. And so we recognize that these are not two separate systems, but ultimately we're serving the whole health. So I always like to say, you can't cut off the head from the rest of the body. You have to serve the whole person. And so when we're talking about ACEs and trauma-informed care, it's so critical in going back to the workforce and helping bridge the gap between the physical health as well as behavioral health is critical. And one of the largest strengths we have in our system is the actual provider network. And we have quite a bit of specialty areas. And one of the areas that is especially important, especially for kids in foster care, is the birth to 5. And understanding what development looks like versus times that interventions are necessary. And so not everybody that is trained as a therapist understands 0 to 5, and so really looking to those specialized skill sets, including evidence-based interventions for children and families that have experienced trauma. And so going back to, in regard to how the system design is further integrating physical health benefit with behavioral health benefit, several years ago, the legislature passed Senate Bill 1375, which asked multiple state agencies, Department of Health, as Division of Behavioral Health was still under DHS, Department of Child Safety, the Arizona Medicaid system, and Access, to take a look and evaluate what would be the best system design for our kids in care. And so at that time, we had actually recommended integrating the healthcare service delivery under CMDP. And to Dr. Park's earlier point, we are the only program in the nation that actually houses our health plan within the Department of Child Safety. And so we have a really close working relationship between the state Medicaid agency that pays the bills and our DCS through, again, this really unique healthcare management model. And so not only historically has CMDP taking care of the physical health services, but our plan is to actually integrate the management of behavioral health services for kids in care starting on 10/1 of 2020. And so that's going to be here before we know it, and that provides us with really unique opportunities to understand and develop a network of highly trained, skilled individuals to work with the unique situation that our children and families are facing, and to make sure we have the resources and develop the network in order to effectively look to have children return to their families or for other types of permanency as far as adoption. And so we're really looking to help continue to improve the system of care toward the ultimate outcome of decreasing time independency and increasing, permanency.
So I will take over from where Sarah's left off, Dr. Salek's left off. And I want to give her credit for another initiative that they're taking part in, because although we have begun the integration at the health plan level, there's also the TI system to try to do that at the provider level. Because again, we want providers to, or the people on the ground who are actually taking care of the children, to look at both the physical aspect and the behavioral health aspects of their care, and not think of them as two separate things. Right now, there's a lot of efforts at care coordination between those two systems, and it doesn't necessarily always work well. And so if at the provider level we can accomplish that, that's the first step. As we're doing that and bringing the trauma-informed lens into that scenario as well, that provides that optimal situation, not just for children in foster care, because as I explained to other people, when you go out and you teach a provider of any sort, whether it's a physician, a therapist, a physical behavioral health therapist, your child care worker, whoever it is, if you are teaching them about whatever it might be that is going to affect the care of that child, they don't look to see, oh, are you a DCS child? Are you, what insurance do you have? They don't do that. They treat everybody the same way. So the goal is, when you do begin to incorporate that information or that lens into everybody's vernacular, they apply it to every child that they see. So I'm part of, I do a course at the University of Arizona for medical students, so we discuss it there. Once you start training everybody at the different levels, and they bring that lens into place, it will come. So integration is just the beginning of that, integration at all the different levels. And then it's, again, teaching that village how to recognize, so that recognition is the first part. The second part is intervention. What do we do about it? How do we put the supports in place to support that family and support that child, support that relationship between the child and that parent, so that they don't have to come into DCS custody? I would like to not have a job in 20 years, please. That is your mission from now on. What do you do to help us keep children out of DCS custody?
I would like you to not also have a job.
Yes.
Maybe a different job. We'd still like for you to be employed at
that. Maybe I can retire.
I'm going to ask everyone on the panel. I'll start with Dr. Christ. Of everything you heard from Dr. Perry this morning, is there one thing that comes to you that you would want to reinforce, a message that you would like to reinforce?
I think one of the most important things, and this can be said again for almost any public health issue, but prevention really is key, if you can get in get to that child or that family and provide prevention and the tools, you're going to have a much better outcome long term. And I think listening to the keynote speech this morning, it really reminds me that, we're looking at a spectrum. And so you have to engage each level of that spectrum. So you've got the prevention for the kids that either aren't born or are very early on. You've got the kids that may be going through trauma but may need that wraparound support to get that resilience and that loving, supportive environment so that what they're experiencing now doesn't impact them later on. And then you've got the older kids and the adults who have experienced trauma that maybe didn't get that support, who now need ongoing support to deal with that trauma and the co-occurrences that they're also suffering from. So I think really looking at each of those stages and providing the interventions and the resources that they need at each of those interventions. But if you want to put an end to it, you really have to start way downstream at the prevention piece.
And I would say relationships. Right. The importance of children being connected to family, to community, and culture cannot be overstated. So I think that's the piece that I would really emphasize. Our shared humanity supersedes our systems and our agencies. All of these things that we put in place. And I always think about the example of breastfeeding. So I was not breastfed as a child. My mom gave me formula because she was convinced that was better for me. Indigenous cultures forever, right, have breastfed, and now we try to undo what systems have put in place. And so if we can remember sort of that shared humanity, the way that we can treat each other and sort of go back almost in time, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. And relationship certainly is one of the most important.
I think you've said it all. But I would say that coordination and cooperation with not just agencies or government agencies, but with the community to be able to achieve this is very, very important. I can't emphasize more what Dr. Contreras and Dr. Christ have said already. That it is a vital part of what is going to be successful for us. It's not just looking at treating and dealing with our hurt individuals now and being able to do that in a thoughtful, trauma-informed way, but preventing the children from getting there. And as society, that's one of our goals. That's what we need to be able to do.
I think one really critical take home in addition to those is in regards to knowing what we don't know. And recognizing that explaining neuroscience is a quite complex challenge. I oftentimes say it's because we're using the brain to understand the brain. And so the field of neuroscience continues to evolve and change. So for example, 20 plus years ago, we felt that all of brain development pretty much occurred in the first 3 years of life. And through additional scientific discovery and questioning that theory, we've now learned, thankfully, that the brain continues to change and develop. And the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive functioning of our brain, thankfully continues to develop into our mid-20s. And so as the science evolves, we might discover, our theories have changed and updated based on new scientific discovery. So what we know right now in 2018, we're continuing to evolve and change. And I think ultimately being open to alternative facts in regards to what the science is saying.
Well, I want to just thank this amazing panel for all of your work and your insights into this. And while I think we acknowledge there's a lot of work to do, there's a lot of wonderful groundwork that has been done. And we're just truly grateful for all of you being here today and everything you've done for our state.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you again, Mrs. Ducey, for bringing us together and for really kind of inspiring me and lighting a fire under all of us to have this conversation to include more non-traditional partners. The point of relationships, again, cannot be understated. Preventing adverse childhood experiences for our young kids is critical. How we respond and engage with our adult population is just as critical, because if not, these cycles, generational or otherwise, we won't ever be able to get our hands around them. So I'm very grateful to everyone who's here, to this panel, to the First Lady specifically, and for you all for making it through the morning with us and sticking around. The room is still full, even though I'm right between you and lunch. So for lunch, just a couple of announcements logistically. Lunch is going to be served buffet style outside. You can sit inside, you can sit outside. After lunch, you're going to move on to your workshops or your breakouts. They're indicated at the bottom of your name tag where you're supposed to go. We appreciate if you stick to that, but somebody said no? Okay. We appreciate if you stick to it because it helps us for flow and capacity. But of course, you're all grown-ups. And we know that there's a lot of exciting topics that we are having. Also, please come back after the workshops to this room. Marcia and I, we're going to have a great conversation with you about next steps and where do we go from here, and having some closing remarks. So you'll get a lot of joy from all of us as your reward if you come back here and join us for the closing session. There are no rewards. The feds don't let me pay for that kind of thing. But we'd appreciate you coming back. So again, this concludes our panel. I again want to thank Dr. Chris, Dr. Contreras, Dr. Park, Dr. Salick for your insights and for all of the great work that you're doing in this space. So thank you so much. 5 minutes early.
Thank you all so much.